More people are flying than ever, and cameras and phones are all part of the trip, capturing unbelievable moments of danger.
Oh my God, the plane is on fire.
For the first time, we unpack the science of what's really going on in these caught-on-camera crises.
Brace for impact, brace for impact.
Revealing in forensic detail how and why flights turn deadly.
He was literally clinging to the air to stay airborne.
Unravelling secret stories from cockpit error to engine failure.
So we've just had an announcement, we've got an emergency landing.
From freak weather to meltdown on the runway.
Oh my God! It's crashed.
Oh my God.
Discover the surprising truth behind planes gone viral. In this episode, passengers brace for impact on a plane with landing gear failure.
When you hear the command brace, brace, you must adopt the brace position shown on your safety card.
An aircraft is on the runway when something goes drastically wrong. One maintenance error has near catastrophic consequences.
Okay, so we've just had an announcement, we've got an emergency landing. We don't know what's going on, but we've told we've got an emergency landing.
And planes literally explode as they come crashing down. Aircraft manufacturers continue to invent new ways to carry more passengers further, faster and cheaper than ever before. But when plane technology fails, the pressure is on the pilots to land safely, saving the lives of everybody on board. December 29th, 2014. Virgin Atlantic VS-43, a Boeing 747, takes off from Gatwick Airport, carrying 459 passengers and crew, headed for Las Vegas.
As soon as the aircraft is off the ground, one of the first things that the crew do is they just check that the altimeter is registering a climb and that they're clear of the ground, and then whoever's not flying calls to the other guy and says, pull the undercarriage up. So this big lever goes up and all of the wheels start retracting.
As the undercarriage begins retracting into the fuselage, the crew become aware that there's a problem.
They're not quite sure what it was, but the undercarriage was not coming up as it should do.
A warning message in the cockpit alerts the crew that there's a significant loss of hydraulic fluid from the right main landing gear.
When the aircraft are being designed, you have critical systems that you can't afford to lose in total. Those systems, such as hydraulic systems, are used for everything from lowering the undercarriage to operating the flight controls and the speed brakes.
In modern passenger jets, hydraulic fluid is used to power the landing gear, enabling it to extend and retract on takeoff and landing. Without hydraulic fluid to release the undercarriage, the crew may not be able to land the aircraft.
On this occasion, it was discussed amongst the crew and their engineering that it was decided actually it was best, because of the nature of the problem and where the engineering facilities were, and it was a hydraulic issue, that they should return to Gatwick.
Pilots immediately make a U-turn and head back to Gatwick.
The airplane was ready for a trip to Las Vegas. It had an awful lot of fuel on board, and airplanes, when they get off the ground for a long trip, are heavier than they are allowed to be when they land. So they had to actually go to an area where it's safe for pumping fuel out of the tanks into the air.
If it's necessary to make an unscheduled landing, you have to dump fuel, because if you don't, when you come into land, the mass of the aircraft is so great still that the landing gear is likely to have a technical failure. It's likely to break when you try to land the aircraft.
With 170 tons of fuel on board, the pilots make their way to the Bristol Channel, circling to burn and jettison as much as they can.
What you want to do is get your aircraft weight down, and you do that by dumping fuel. And you select that in the cockpit, you decide how much fuel you want to get rid of, and then you press a button and it's jettisoned out through typically tubes on the wingtips.
Now, passengers are informed their aircraft is to make an emergency landing.
The pilots are trained, they're trained extensively on how to communicate matters, important matters to passengers. And it's also important that this is explained to people that this is a serious matter and that their attention is now required.
The procedure for an emergency landing obviously varies from airline to airline. We're talking about a planned emergency. The captain calls the senior crew member and tell about the nature of the emergency, so what's going on, the intention, like what's going to happen, what we're going to do about it, and the TDs, the time available, how long we've got for. If it's something like the landing gear, for example, the captain might decide that the aircraft has to come to an immediate landing due to a technical reason.
So please do follow any advice that they give you through this landing. You do not need your life jacket. We are landing on land. Leave your life jacket where it is.
When you are in this situation, a part of you at the beginning will obviously think, I'm a human being and my life is actually in someone else's hands. But after all, your training kicks in. That's what I'm here for. I'm not just here to serve tea and coffee. I'm actually here to save lives.
4 hours later, they're almost 100 tons of fuel lighter. The pilots make their final checks before landing.
The aircraft has the nose gear and then 4 main landing gears onto the body. They are very large bits of kit and they take a lot of stress over their lifetime, so it's a really important part of the aircraft.
The crew attempt to deploy the landing gear, but they quickly realise it's worse than they thought. The right main landing gear hasn't extended. Only 3 out of 4 main sets of wheels drop down. The captain has no idea why the aircraft's undercarriage is stuck. Before every takeoff and landing, an aircraft undergoes a number of maintenance checks. The night before VS-43 was due to depart, maintenance workers replaced the actuator in the right-hand landing gear.
In the hydraulic system of an aircraft, you've got the pump that creates the hydraulic pressure, and that'll go down the pipes and it'll go to what's called an actuator, and the actuator is there to convert the hydraulic pressure into mechanical activity. So if you like it, it'll push a piston that pushes a rod out that moves something, and in this case, it would lower the undercarriage.
When the actuator is pumped full of fluid, it works like a muscle, extending and retracting the legs of the undercarriage. The pilots continue to circle as they try to troubleshoot the issue. Further attempts to extend the right landing gear fail. The hydraulic leak has left insufficient fluid to drive the actuator. Without it, the undercarriage leg can't fall into its correct position for landing. Instead, it jams sideways against its door.
When you lose a hydraulic system that controls the gear, you have to use an alternate system. And that alternate system really relies primarily on gravity. So it just lets the wheels fall down and lock into place using gravity and air pressure.
When the captain triggers the alternate system, nothing happens.
This must have been a bit worrying because it's not something you practice for and you're not quite sure what the aeroplane's going to do.
The flight crew would definitely be concerned that they have a problem with their landing gear. If ever a flight crew member feels that one of their landing gear legs isn't down in the correct position, it's a big concern.
The captain has no option. He must land the plane at Gatwick with only 3 of the 4 main landing gear.
Centre of gravity is really important from a pilot's point of view, and that's because the aircraft has to be weighted so that you can control it at all times.
The centre of gravity is the point over which an aircraft balances to remain in an upright position. In a normal landing, to ensure the plane touches down in the correct position, the weight the aircraft is carrying must be evenly spread throughout the fuselage.
Large aircraft are so heavy, they need large undercarriage. Now these are very big bits of equipment, the undercarriage. They're very tall, the wheels are massive, and there are lots of them. The worry is that you've got an unequal distribution of weight. So one gear on one side is taking a lot more weight than the gears on the other side.
With only 80% of Flight VS-43's landing gear now operational, the captain comes up with a plan. He instructs all passengers to move to the left-hand side of the plane, shifting its centre of gravity to prevent it from tipping over as it lands.
That's why seating arrangements are so important, why you have to take your seat because of the weight of the aircraft and balancing the aircraft.
With everyone now in place, the flight crew readies passengers for the worst.
When the aircraft stops, you may or may not hear, depending on whether the captain expects to evacuate. Should he want an evacuation, you will hear, "This is an emergency evacuation. Evacuate, evacuate, evacuate."
You do think about these scenarios. Sometimes you think about, oh, you'd be a hero at the end of it, or then you think about, well, what if something happened to myself? Everyone's allowed to feel nervous, everyone's allowed to be scared. But I think being put in that situation though, because of your training, your main point of call is getting these passengers off safely. I think that just kicks into you straight away.
You must look at your exits now, your nearest could be behind you. Stay calm, read your safety card, and practice the brace position now.
Hands over your head, don't cross them, just hands over the head.
Need 7 tower behind the landing, 747 enter 26 left and Mike behind. Needed fire 2 plus 1 behind landing, 747 short front enter 26 left at Charlie behind. Fire 6 behind landing, 747 enter 26 left at Delta behind. Fire 6 behind landing, 747. Fire 3 plus 1 division 26 left once the boat traffic has come to a stop, wherever that may be.
"300 tons of aircraft slam down on the runway at 160 miles an hour. The 747 finally comes to a halt, leaning heavily to one side.
Runway 26 left, close that time, 15:40.
Fortunately, the conditions were pretty kind on the day. The wind wasn't too gusty or anything like that, because it didn't have the outboard wheels on one side. If the wind had been blowing from that side, it would have tipped the airplane over.
Good pilot manoeuvring and favourable weather conditions mean the aircraft lands safely, and all 459 passengers and crew are successfully evacuated without injury.
Of course, it's not ideal, but it's been demonstrated on this occasion that a Virgin Atlantic jumbo can land safely, and there's a positive outcome, landing on 3 landing gear legs.
Shortly after the incident, investigators discover that the night before VS-43 took off, maintenance workers installed the 185-pound actuator upside down. As the landing gear begins retracting shortly after takeoff, the port boss fitting is damaged, causing a hydraulic leak. But that's not all. Investigators also suggest the maintenance worker's error is due to a fault with the design of the actuator itself. It's uniform in shape and colour, and the labelling is insufficient to tell easily which is the right way up. The inquiry recommends Boeing modify the actuator to reduce risks of a recurrence. Boeing said, "We have reviewed this safety recommendation and believe the figure of the retract actuator in the airplane maintenance manual could be improved, and it is planned to update this figure to add callouts to the up and down hydraulic ports." It's a reminder that sometimes the smallest mistake can be critical. But even when an aircraft has all its wheels, a smooth landing can still go wrong.
Lütfen daha hızlı.
January the 13th, 2018, a Boeing 737-800 carrying 168 people prepares to land at Trabzon domestic airport after a short flight from Turkey's capital, Ankara.
Here we have an airplane landing in the middle of the night at an airport called Trabzon on the northern coast of Turkey. It's a single runway airport with a runway that parallels the sea.
The end of the runway is just 65 yards from a 45-degree slope leading straight down into the Black Sea. The aircraft's on its final approach. It's been an uneventful flight.
It was the middle of the night, it was round about midnight local time when the aircraft touched down, and everything seemed to be going fine.
For the two pilots, there's no reason to think it won't be a straightforward landing like hundreds of others.
Whenever we want to have an aircraft leave the ground or land back on the ground, we're managing this transition between having a flying machine, which is designed to fly at high levels, and the wings have got to give us lift in this thin air at 30 to 40,000 feet. And then when we get near to the ground, we now want to slow the airplane right down. So whereas the cruise speed might be around about 500 miles an hour, we want to slow down to as slow as possible.
As the Pegasus flight touches down on the runway at Trabzon Airport, pilots deploy the reverse thrusters, rapidly reducing the speed of the aircraft, slowing it down to a taxiing speed of approximately 25 miles an hour.
It was already going quite slowly, and it was approaching the end of the runway. It suddenly swerved to the left, went off the left side of the runway, across the rough ground, and then started going down the very steep slope towards the sea.
As the 737 careers down the slope, the right engine breaks off, and the landing gear collapses beneath the fuselage, wedging the aircraft in the mud.
Lütfen daha hızlı.
It then came to an absolute halt with its nose steeply down the slope. The cabin would have been at a crazy angle. Must have been extremely upsetting for the passengers.
The aircraft is precariously positioned at a 45-degree angle just yards from the sea. Fearing the plane could slide into the water at any moment, the flight crew immediately execute an unplanned emergency evacuation.
That would be awful. I can't even imagine what that would be like. I can imagine that crew would have to get into form really quickly.
There is an important training on getting everyone off safely. We only have 90 seconds to get 250 people off, and that's not a lot of time.
You'd hear a call from the captain saying, cabin crew, you know, evacuate, evacuate, evacuate. So on that signal, you check out your door area to make sure there's no fires or anything like blocking the exit. Open the door and just go into command mode straight away.
On this Pegasus flight, there are 8 emergency exit locations. 2 at the front, 4 over the wings, and 2 at the rear.
At that particular accident, the overwing door were not useful. It was not possible to use them, and because obviously the front was absolutely jammed.
With both the front and wing emergency exits unusable, flight attendants have just seconds to get all passengers up the steep incline and out of the rear doors.
When we open them evacuation doors and we're getting the passengers off, we just want to do it as quickly as possible because we don't know if there's a fire about to start or an explosion, etc. So then you'd be having to tell passengers, not this way, go this way.
When the people had to get out of the airplane, there wasn't really very much need for escape slides, so they were almost stepping out of the doors onto the rough ground. Fortunately, nobody got hurt. All the passengers got out safely and they scrambled back up the slope to the airfield.
Next morning in daylight, the scale of the crash is clear to see. The passengers were lucky to escape with their lives. What went wrong at what should be the safest part of a landing? Trabzon Airport is now one of the top 10 busiest domestic airports in the world, serving over 3 million passengers a year. This was the first runway incident after 60 years. Investigators were stunned. They're yet to publish conclusive findings. But there are a number of theories as to the cause of the incident.
Was it something that the crew did, or was it something the crew didn't do? Was there a technical fault? It could have been braking, it could have been a sudden failure that we don't even know about yet of the left-hand gear leg.
Investigators hone in on the most likely culprit, the reverse thrusters. When a plane takes off, air is sucked into the engine and expelled out the back to create maximum speed. When a 737-800 lands, the cowls around the rear sides of the engine retract, redirecting the air blast back through the vents to help slow it down. When the aircraft nears the end of the runway, the reverse thrusters are turned off and the brakes are fully applied, bringing it to a halt. But the sudden turn at the end of the runway suggests that the reverse thrust in the left-hand engine remained on.
If the aeroplane misbehaved and only one engine went into reverse thrust, one engine would push forward with high amount of power and the other one would try to push back. But the engine pushing forward would win hands down.
Did the reverse thrust fail to cancel on the left-hand engine? Did it fail to cancel and therefore slew the aeroplane around and over the edge? That's the kind of thing that might have made an aeroplane swerve when nobody intended it to.
This is just one theory. We won't know what really happened until the investigation is complete. The Pegasus flight almost ended up in the Black Sea. But what happens when you come face to face with a real threat of having to ditch an aircraft in open water? July 29th, 2015. At Hong Kong, a Cathay Pacific 777 carrying 270 passengers and crew takes off on a long-haul journey to LA. Halfway through the 15-hour flight, instruments indicate there's a problem with the cooling fan below the cabin floor.
We've got a Cathay Pacific 777-300 aircraft. So whilst it's over the sea, it then has a problem with the air conditioning system, the cooling system, that's blowing cool air into the avionic bay. And this is really important on aircraft because cooling air is used to cool the backs of the computers. And we know that lots of computers are used in controlling aircraft. So this is really, really important.
Inside the aircraft, this cooling fan forces cold air up through the cockpit to aid ventilation to the hundreds of electronic systems used to fly the plane. Within minutes of being alerted to the cooling fan failure, pilots detect smoke coming into the cockpit.
The fan that blows some of that cold air into the back of the computer failed. What's likely to have happened is this is a mechanical device. Mechanical devices wear out, and occasionally things do happen, so bearings can fail, windings on motors can fail, and when it did fail, it produced smoke.
30,000 feet up in the air in a confined space, smoke can be fatal.
The worst thing that can happen on an aeroplane, above all else you don't want, is a fire, because if you can't stop it, it might asphyxiate the crew, the passengers, etc. So a fire is the most terrifying thing that can happen. You've got to do something about it very, very fast and try and get the airplane on the ground as fast as you possibly can.
The pilots have no option. They'll have to make an emergency landing.
The flight crew know at all times exactly where they are because they've got modern avionics that tell them where the nearest airport is at any time. If they detect smoke, they will then make an immediate diversion to the nearest airfield. There's no ifs, no buts. They follow a checklist. The top of the checklist says identify the nearest airfield, and they will go for it.
But there's one problem. The nearest commercial airport is at Anchorage, over 1,200 miles away.
When smoke is detected on a large commercial aircraft, the first thing that the flight crew will be thinking about is how quickly can I land? And that is the decision. Not should I land, but how quickly can I land?
Unfortunately, the stricken aircraft is flying over the North Pacific Ocean. 25-year-old passenger Ethan Williams films himself during the flight.
Okay, so I'm not sure what's happening, but there's something going on this flight. All the flight attendants are running around like crazy, and there's warning signs going off. Hopefully it's nothing too bad, and I think we're right, but I don't know, we'll see. They're all running around like mad. They're doing something, checking the emergency exits and like grabbing bags and running forward, and I don't know, something's not right.
Your main role of there is for the safety of the aircraft and the safety of the passengers. All the food and drink, etc. That's just for competitions with other airlines. The main thing is to make sure the cabin is secure, the passengers are secure. And then if this time permits, then you can reassure passengers and calm them down and just try and make them feel a bit better and inform them what you know, just to reassure them.
Where there's smoke, there could be fire. Whether a plane's over land or water, its captain has just 15 minutes to get it down.
They must land immediately. They won't dilly-dally. Fire is one of those unusual things. The longer it goes, the harder it is to control. The aircraft at the time was over water, so they prepared for the worst, i.e. prepared for a ditching.
The flight crew have no alternative but to prepare passengers to land in the water.
Preparing for an emergency ditching, it is something that no cabin crew would like to go through. You only want to do that on your training center once a year. Nevertheless, it's part of your job. We are cabin crew, we are trained to do this, and we know what we're doing.
Okay, so we've just had announcements. We've got an emergency landing. We don't know what's going on, but we've told we've got an emergency landing.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to do an emergency landing, and it might be necessary for us to make an emergency ditching. Follow the instructions given by the cabin crew.
Remove your shoes, please. Safety jacket under your seat.
Place the jacket over your head and secure the tape firmly around your waist. Do not place the life jacket at any time. When at the exit, rock will get onto the inside.
You know that you're probably not going to walk away from a ditching at night in the ocean, in the middle of nowhere, in a very cold ocean as well. We have to cope with that. It's part of our job. So flight attendants would look into each other and think this is it. However, you have a chance, and we know that if there is a chance to walk away, is by doing what we've been taught to do it, and that follow the procedures and training and brief the passenger accordingly.
When you hear the face, put your hands, side, and
We landed in approximately 2 minutes.
Obviously, when there is a planned emergency, the cabin crew will have to basically make sure that they know how to brace, they know when to brace, and most importantly, know how long to brace for.
My brace position is good.
With everyone on board fully prepared to ditch in the ocean, the aircraft is ready to make its final descent.
We've had indications in the flight deck that we have decided for this course of action for us, and we are anticipating a normal landing. So I want to reiterate it will be a normal landing. However, we have decided that this is the safest course of action at this point in time. So please do follow the instructions of your crew, and I will speak to you once we're on the ground in Shemya, and we can expect to land just over here. Thank you.
So that's really good news, guys. We're diverting to Shemya, and it's going to be a normal landing, not a water landing. So that's really good news, but still don't know why, but it doesn't really matter, I suppose, as long as we land okay. We're going to be landing in 10 minutes.
Just minutes before ditching, the crew make contact with Erickson Air Station, a remote US airbase on the tiny Alaskan island of Shemya, where they're cleared to land.
We've landed. Yes.
They were able to land the aircraft, and the outcome was really positive. Just because passengers put on their life jackets doesn't necessarily mean that they would be required to land on the sea. Sometimes it's better to be prepared. Prepare for the worst, plan for the best.
The cooling fan issue is a quick fix. 2 hours later, the flight is back in the air with all passengers and crew on board. Ditching in water is a rare event. In the last 7 decades, there have only been 4 cases of controlled emergency ditching by passenger planes. On this occasion, the Cathay Pacific flight narrowly avoided crashing into the ocean. But not everyone is so lucky.
He's ditching.
Oh! Holy sh! Oh my god!
Ditching. Not really very much is known about ditching because for very obvious reasons. You don't throw aeroplanes away by ditching them on purpose.
Oh, he's ditching. He's ditching. Oh!
I think any successful ditching is going to be largely down to pilot skill.
Whoa. Every year, an average of 12 small aircraft make controlled ditchings. In Siberia, bystanders capture the moment this Cessna's engine fails, forcing the pilot to ditch in the freezing waters of Lake Baikal.
The aircraft is a single-engined aircraft. It takes off, gets airborne, and then you can hear the engine stopped. It hasn't got enough power to stay airborne, and in a single-engine aircraft, if you haven't got enough power to stay airborne, the only way is down.
Wow.
The Cessna's short wings create less drag, but to keep it in the air, it must fly at faster airspeeds. In this aircraft, its sudden loss of power means it can't generate enough speed and lift to remain airborne. The pilot's only choice is to make a controlled ditch in the water before it stalls. And as the plane comes down, the Cessna's fixed landing gear poses an even bigger problem.
Wow.
The problem with an aircraft with a fixed landing gear, the first thing to touch the water is going to be the landing gear, which is bad because it tends to, the drag of hitting the water can make the aircraft pitch nose down and sort of pulp a submarine underneath the water.
Witnesses film the passengers desperately scrambling out of the plane as it begins to sink into one of the world's deepest lakes. With the Cessna's wings positioned above the cabin, it's submerged in water. With no buoyancy aid to keep it afloat, the passengers and crew have just minutes to get out before they drown.
The pilot, I think, did a pretty good job of successfully ditching the aircraft. The passengers were pretty quick and got out in time, and thankfully nobody drowned.
Ditching a plane is one of a pilot's worst nightmares. But having to ditch a commercial airliner with hundreds of passengers on board is an experience few can recount. One emergency landing made headlines around the world. In the skies over New York in 2009, US Flight 1459 suffered a double engine failure as a result of a bird strike at 2,800 feet.
It smashed both engines. So Captain Sully Sullenberg, he had no power. He suddenly had a glider on his hands.
At 30,000 feet, a modern passenger jet can glide for approximately 100 miles, 3 miles for every 1,000 feet. But at an altitude of less than 3,000 feet and descending fast, Flight 1459 has only minutes in the air before the plane comes down.
He looked around for, can I glide back to the airfield, decided no, and there was the Hudson River, and he thought, that's big.
4 minutes after takeoff, Chesley Sully Sullenberger has few alternatives. He has to make an emergency landing on the Hudson River. The plane could shatter on impact. All he can do is pick the right moment to keep the nose up and the wings level for touchdown.
The airplane set down and it floated. And Passengers get out onto the wings and they're standing there and the aeroplane's floating.
Miraculously, the plane remains intact, and everyone on board is safely evacuated out onto the wings before being rescued.
Captain Sully Sullenberger did manage to do a marvellous job for us. That's been invaluable for aviation because it's taught us how a modern aeroplane can behave if it's ditched skillfully under good conditions. And what I mean by good conditions is flat water, not much wind, good visibility, and daylight. That was a ditching under as much of an ideal condition as you can have. So Sully did a brilliant job, but he did get lucky with the conditions.
Ditching remains uncommon. But what happens when you can't reach a runway and you have to land in an urban area?
Land is better if the aircraft force lands on land, but in many cases the aircraft may well be flying over, let's say, a built-up area. It can be very hazardous, or even more hazardous than ditching.
2 small aircraft crash land every week due to pilot error, bad weather conditions, and technical faults. But the most common cause of non-fatal accidents involving small aircraft are bad landings. In Florida, there were 5 cases alone where planes were forced to land on public highways. St. Petersburg, Florida. CCTV footage captures a twin-engine Cessna 402B as it uses 18th Avenue South as a runway, taking out trees, power lines, and 2 cars in the process. And about 15 miles away in Pinellas County, sheriffs capture the moment this 4-seater single-engine Rockwell loses power. The plane suddenly banks right, narrowly missing their squad car. It hits a tree and crashes into a fence, bringing it to a halt on the sidewalk. The pilot and his passenger walk away unscathed. Luckily for them, the incident occurred on a quiet suburban road. But this isn't an isolated incident.
What the is going on right now? Holy holy that's unbelievable. Awesome.
Mukilteo, Washington, 3:40 p.m. Drivers come to a stop at the streetlights on Harbor Point Boulevard Southwest. It's just an ordinary day. Shortly after takeoff from a nearby airfield, a single-engine aircraft is in trouble. Suffering from a loss of engine power, the pilot has no option but to put the plane down wherever he can.
Sometimes you only have a matter of seconds before the aircraft is going to land unexpectedly. It's one of the worst nightmares for if you're flying a small aircraft like this. If you're at very low altitude, under 1,000 feet, it's really, really tough. And it is scary, but you haven't got time to be scared. What you've got to do is just focus on getting your aircraft onto the ground.
A dashboard camera captures the 2-seater Piper PA hitting a power line and street light as it makes an emergency landing. The aircraft has been airborne for just 10 minutes and is full of fuel. A Piper PA can carry a maximum of 84 gallons. Divided between its two main tanks, one on each wing, and its two wingtip tanks. When the plane hits the power line, a surge of electricity travels through the aircraft, heating the fuel in the wings. The Piper's right wingtip then collides with the streetlight, rupturing the reinforced fiberglass fuel cell, which ignites the gasoline, causing a terrifying explosion that brings the plane crashing down on vehicles below. The crash sparks a car fire and a widespread power outage. Fortunately, no one was injured. It's been over 100 years since the first plane made its maiden flight. With approximately 300,000 planes touching down every day, why is landing an aircraft still so difficult?
When an aircraft approaches a runway, lots of things are going to happen. It's going to have to transform from being a flying machine to a wheeled machine, and it's going to have to do that within the confines of the available space on the runway.
Landing accidents are the most frequent form of aircraft accident, which is why people are nervous about landings.
Takeoff and landing are considered to be critical stages of flight, and that's where there's no extraneous conversation in the cockpit. All the pilots are concentrating 100% because the potential is there to go wrong.
Flying has never been safer. The industry has systems in place to try and make sure that no mistake slips through the net.
Flying is by far the safest form of transport out there. You're far more likely to be involved in an accident going to the airport and away from it. That's how safe the industry is. When there is a crash, it makes worldwide news. But accidents are so few and far between, almost makes it not worth worrying about.